in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Today we celebrate the feast of King Saint Henry II. So he was born in the year 973 to Duke Henry II of Bavaria. And there was, at this time, we take a lot of our political, well, it used to be political stability in the world for granted. But here, boy, this is the very beginnings of the of Europe as we know it, is the emergence of kingdoms like Hungary, Poland, Germany, France. These places didn't really exist yet as political entities. So there was a lot of uncertainty. So young Henry, at first, was educated to become a cleric. He was a son of a king, but the current emperor wanted to make sure, he wanted to lessen his risk for claimants to the imperial throne. So he was choosing who was going to enter the clerical state to prevent them trying to aspire after political ambitions. So this was a great benefit to young Henry. He was educated by an archbishop and received an excellent education and an excellent upbringing with piety and the love of God. And certainly that is what directed the whole rest of his life, was that foundation in solid piety. How important is the education of our youth, the example of those who are in charge of them. Well, the current emperor had an untimely death, and his successor also died at a young age. And this left the throne up for discussion, we could say. And so young Henry, perhaps seeing opportunity, went after and decided to pursue becoming named the Holy Roman Emperor. And this is proof that the saints are not always saints, in that he left behind that ecclesiastical career. He wasn't a cleric, but he saw that there was that opportunity, and he wasn't the first in line to be named for the throne. In fact, he at one point, he did a lot of political maneuvering to become a candidate, and at one point he even imprisoned an archbishop who wasn't supporting him. That's not the best thing to do, even though, I don't know, I wouldn't mind seeing some archbishops in prison these days. But it was not the right thing to do, right? So that showed that even though he had this pious upbringing, when great power presented itself as a possibility, he took it. He went after it. And so that was not the most edifying moment of his life there as a young man, seizing power. But he was successful, engaged in a few military campaigns to secure his power. And one of them, perhaps an ambitious effort, was his marriage to Cunigunde. She was Princess of Lithuania or Luxembourg, something like that. But it was politically expedient, that marriage. But she herself had received a very pious upbringing. In fact, she's a saint in the church. Her feast day is March 3rd in some calendars. And she'd made a vow of virginity prior to the marriage. And she told King Henry this, that she was a virgin and she wanted to remain so after their marriage. King Henry, for himself, still had quite a tremendous amount of piety himself, and he said that was fine with him. He took a vow of virginity, which they kept for their entire marriage, for over the next 20 years. They never had any children, never consummated the marriage whatsoever. But her influence was very important on King Henry II, and we would say what that saying, behind every good man is a good woman, behind every saintly man, right, is a saintly woman, whether it's the Blessed Virgin or someone else. In Henry's case, it was his holy wife, Saint Cunigunde. She, at one point, there is a story that she was accused of unfaithfulness, and that King Henry made her walk over red-hot plowshares, which she did, and then that made him compunction of heart. He was sorry for that, believing those accusations. But she became his most trusted advisor. He gave her a lot of political power, a lot of influence over the kingdom, and even over where imperial funds were spent. And she built monasteries, donated lands, built houses to help the poor. And so certainly we have to say that when you have two people of a very similar disposition, especially when it's towards sanctity, it just supports each other. That's actually precisely what marriage is for, is two people on their way to heaven supporting the pious efforts of both. So we see that very much in their very holy friendship. So eventually Henry was named, he was not the Holy Roman Emperor. This was about 12 years after being named King of Germany. He became the Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Benedict VIII. Now, Benedict VIII had been living in Rome, as had his previous successors, under the control of, there was the ruler of Rome. John Crescentius was his name, and he sought himself Holy Roman Emperor, and he was telling the popes what to do, putting them in prison, and so on. So Benedict VIII escaped and fled and found refuge with King Henry. Henry gave him support, marched on to Rome, deposed the unlawful ruler there, and reinstated Benedict VIII as Pope. In return, Benedict VIII crowned him Holy Roman Emperor, and in fact they called a synod right there in Rome. And clerical celibacy was enforced, simony was outlawed, lands that had been seized were restored to the church. So a great amount of good was accomplished by that. Henry was definitely, by this time, right, it had been 12 years that he had been ruler, named Holy Roman Emperor. And perhaps at this time, we could say soon after this, or by this time, his ambitions had cooled a little bit. He wasn't so, perhaps, interested in power anymore. He'd seen the limits of it, the intrigues. Perhaps he was getting tired of it, because soon after this, he decided he wanted to become a monk. He was done with it, the imperial rule, the reign, the wars. He was done with it all. So he goes to Belgium and asks the abbot there, the Abbot of Verdun, to accept him as a humble monk. The abbot refuses and says, no, right, you're the emperor, you're like the best one we've had in 100, 300 years, you need to keep being emperor. And King Henry's like, no, I'm sick of it, I want to be a monk. The abbot refused. So Emperor Henry ordered him, as your emperor, I order you to accept me as a monk. And the abbot, being a good abbot, he's like, okay, piety dictates as one of your subjects that I obey you, so I will accept you as one of my monks. And King Henry's like, okay, thank you. And the abbot says, as one of my monks, I order you to become emperor. So he gave up after that point. He became a third order Benedictine, though. So he would read the breviary, do the prayers. In fact, after he died, and he would die in 1024, his wife Cunigunde, she would renounce her imperial title and go be a nun at a Benedictine convent for 15 years until the end of her life. So she carried on his spirit in wanting to do that. But despite, even very good souls, despite their best efforts, they do sometimes make errors. And, this is subject to, I would say, wide, great historical speculation. But one of the ways that Emperor Henry wanted to give the church more power was by placing ecclesiastics, clerics, bishops, in positions of civil authority, making them governors, giving them power in the temporal realm. That maybe was a good idea at first, but over the long run, that led to a great deal of corruption. Because then you had men seeing that, men who wanted political power, and they saw the church as a means of getting it. If I became a cleric, if I became a bishop, then I could have political power. And so, and unfortunately, when you give ecclesiastical offices political power, it corrupts it. The men seek that position not because they love God, not because they love souls, but because they love power. So that was an unfortunate side effect that perhaps King Henry didn't have foreseen. So that it shows that even those who are sincere in a position of authority, God does not prevent them from making some very great errors. Another thing that King Henry did, which caused trouble later on, we could say, maybe it was a good thing, maybe it wasn't, but he convinced Benedict VIII to include the word Filioque in the creed, which, if anybody knows history, the Filioque, that was a point of contention for the Eastern Church. That caused the Great Western Schism in 1054. and that has never stopped. It's still a schism to this day. So was that supposed to be there? Was it not supposed to be there? Was that his fault? Well, who knows? All right, but that just, again, it shows that when you have great power and you're making big decisions, for better or for worse, things happen. That's why piety has to be combined with prudence. So let's see. King Henry, when he would travel, he would always stay at monasteries. That was his thing to do. He would visit, he would stay at monasteries. He would always leaving them great gifts, monetary gifts, items of great value, and so on. Just a great patron of the church and of Christ and of the poor. So as I mentioned, he died in the year 1024. And about 100 years later, he was declared a saint, and his wife was declared a saint about 50 years after that. So we have King Saint Henry II and Saint Cunigunde, his wife. Great example of pious rulers and just what temporal power is for. It is not the separation of church and state, but the cooperation of church and state is how it's supposed to work. Is the secular rulers going to the church, going to the bishop, going to the pope and saying, what are my guidelines? I want to do a good job. I want to help my people, and I want to have a good economy, and I want to have prosperous citizens. But how do I do that? What are my limits? What's the morality, the moral constraints, the moral law of God within which I'm able to make laws? That is what the state should be doing with the church. That's the cooperation between the two. The church, for her part, simply states philosophy, states the principles. Look, here are your bounds. You can do this on one side, up to this on the other side. You need to stay within that. If you go outside and start doing these things, you're outside the realm of God. You're outside morality. That's bad. That's evil, morally bad. And if anything is morally bad, it will always be economically bad. Financially bad, whatever, socially bad. The moral law is the guide to human society. If you violate moral law, your society will suffer. If you obey moral law, your society will flourish. That's why we are where we are today, is because the world had the moral law of the church guiding it ever since the formation of Europe. It was the Catholic Church that built Europe, and it was within the moral guidelines of the church. And there's a great difference between those men who try to fulfill the moral law and fail, right? And they fail quite miserably, but they're trying, as opposed to those who don't even try at all, right? The end result can be the same: corruption and evil and murder and war and so on, but the difference is in effort. Are you trying to follow it, or aren't you? Right? God is a God who rewards even the effort. If you put forth the effort, God will reward that. So that can be a great... what would you call that? Maybe motivation or consolation to us today, because our country is not even trying. I mean, we're just going down on a 6-lane highway to hell with 2 trains on either side and a boat bringing people there. It's awful. But if we try, right? If somebody tries, who knows, right? Like Abraham bargaining with God. If there are 10 good men left in America, will you destroy it? If there are 5, there are whatever. We can be part of that number, right? Begging God to have mercy on his country. There's a 54-day novena coming up for that very intention. July 19th, plus 54, whatever that ends up being. Participate in it. Pray the rosary, pray for our country, and pray for the intercession of holy emperors, holy kings and queens throughout history, that they might influence those in positions of power now, to turn back to God, to turn back to morality, and maybe we can turn this country back around and give it back to God. God bless you all in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.